So I want you all to imagine that you've recently moved to a brand new school, okay? Maybe you moved to a new city, you moved into this new school, and you've fallen in with a really great group of friends. You think these people are really nice, they really get you, they understand where you're coming from, and you really enjoy hanging out with them. At first, they're incredibly nice to you, they show you around, they warn you about like who to hang out with and who not to hang out with. They invite you to social activities outside of school, and things are going really well. Then, one day, you show up to school, and the group absolutely shuns you, right? You walk up to them in the hall, and they simultaneously turn their backs on you. You text them in first period, and they just ghost you for the whole day, right? Finally, at lunch, you walk up to them, and they flat out tell you, "We don't want you to hang out with us. You can't sit with us." So the experience that I've just described here is what the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre would call an epistemic crisis. And it has the effect of making you a bit more skeptical within a particular domain. So first, I want you just to consider the structure of the experience that I described, right? You think you know something. In this case, the thing you think you know is that I'm a valued member of this particular friend group. And then suddenly, part two, you realize that you don't know what you thought you did know, what you thought you could take for granted, what for you was absolutely certain. Now notice, this experience can be totally paralyzing. How can you act? How can you go on and do things out in the world until you figure out where you stand with respect to this particular group or this particular issue? Before you can even process what's happened, you have to answer the questions. Why was I so certain that I knew? And how can I be sure that I won't fall victim to this kind of naivete in the future? Okay, so in a way, this thought experiment brings out what I take to be the crucial task of epistemology and its characteristic questions. So I will now share those with you. Epistemology, and this is the unit that we're now entering, right? Epistemology is the study of the mind in relation to reality. Or, I'm trying to give you a couple more or less equivalent definitions, the study of belief and its justification, or the study of knowledge. These are three different ways of defining epistemology, what epistemology is. It's a particular subfield within philosophy, and this is how it's typically defined. Okay. Epistemology's characteristic questions are things like, how do we even know about the world, right? And think about that for a second. It's not asking what we know about the world, right? That would be some sort of empirical science, or depending on the particular class of things or the aspect of reality in question, it might be a branch of philosophy. But epistemology is interested in the how question. How do we even know about the world? How can we even know about the world? It's also interested in the question, how much can we even know? Do we have a lot of knowledge? Is knowledge really easy to come by? Or is it something that's incredibly difficult to acquire and easily lost once acquired? And then finally, there's sort of the meta-epistemological question. How would we even go about answering these questions, right? Given the nature of the mind, given the nature of the world and the connection that would have to obtain therein, how could we even start answering epistemological questions? Epistemological crises, like I've mentioned a second ago, they aren't the only reason to do epistemology, right? Even if epistemological crises, this experience puts the nature and motivations of epistemology in sharp focus. In the remainder of this unit, which is composed of this class period, the next class period, and the one after that, we're going to be talking about several different approaches to answering some of these really foundational epistemological questions. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about skepticism. Epistemologists usually see themselves as providing theoretical explanations of how knowledge is possible. Given the limitations of the mind, given the unpredictability of the natural world, it seems like we're in need of some explanation. How is knowledge even possible? Now, we might call these theories epistemically optimistic, since they assume that we have knowledge and then try to explain how it's possible. An optimistic systematic epistemology might look something like this. Might say, well, perception is fundamentally reliable, and all of our knowledge is somehow built on a perceptual foundation, right? You can't doubt what you see in the world. You can build up all of our knowledge out of this sort of foundation, this base of perceptual beliefs. And since perception is fundamentally reliable, this explains how we can get knowledge. Okay, so that's one sort of optimistic epistemology. Here's another one. You might think, well, God created the mind to know reality, right? God designed our mind to be isomorphic in a way with reality. And since God is a perfect designer, and since God also designed the world, there's going to be some sort of connection or match between what our minds are capable of knowing and the thing known, the world. There's another optimistic epistemology. But okay, so now it's important to note, not all epistemologies are so optimistic, and not all epistemologists are so optimistic. In particular, we have more skeptical epistemologies. For our purposes, skepticism is going to be defined as the epistemological view that we do not, and perhaps cannot, have any knowledge at all. This is a global kind of skepticism, a universal or an absolute skepticism, since it says we can't have knowledge at all, or at least that we don't have knowledge at all. But we'll just use the word skepticism to refer to this strong view that knowledge is absolutely outside of our reach. Skepticism is an ancient view. It's one of the first things that people started thinking about when they started doing philosophy. And it's what we might call a more pessimistic epistemology. Despite its counterintuitive implications, it would mean that we know nothing, right? That I wouldn't know that I'm human. I wouldn't know that I have hands. I don't know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. There is some intuitive motivation behind it. And I hope to show today some of that motivation. But first, what I want to do is I want to show you a spectrum that I call the skeptical spectrum, okay? We're going to study some of these philosophers in class. I do not think I can actually note on the slide itself, so I'll just point it out here. So on the what is my far left, and I assume is your far left of the spectrum, we just have sort of ordinary people, right? So just think about a person on the street, literally, like in this photo. Think about going up to them and asking them, what do you know? I mean, they'd be really puzzled by you. They probably wouldn't answer you. It's like a really weird thing to do. But if you could get them past that, they would probably start listing things. They'd say, well, I know my name. I know that I'm a human being. I know, and they would just go off. They would say, so they would just list a bunch of things, right? We typically think we know like a whole heck of a lot. Slightly further over on the spectrum, we have Augustine, right? Who was a philosopher in the 8th century, I believe. I'm going to Wikipedia that before we talk about Augustine. But he was in like the 8th century. So he came after Plato, came after Aristotle. He's right at the end of the ancient sort of era in philosophy, right at the beginning of the medieval era in philosophy. He thought we could know a lot too. And in fact, the optimistic epistemology I gave earlier, the one that claimed that God designs the mind in a particular way, he buys into at least some of that, right? So he's kind of an optimist. A little further down the spectrum, we have Thomas Reid. There might be some optional readings from Reid, but Reid is a famous defender of common sense, right? Reid says, look out at the world. Of course you know a bunch of things, right? So he sort of takes what the ordinary person would take for granted, maybe in a non-philosophical way, and he tries to build up a philosophical defense of it. Even further over on the spectrum, we have Plato. I didn't put him all the way over on the spectrum because, of course, he thinks he knows at least one thing, right? that he doesn't know anything. But he's pretty far over to the right on the spectrum, as is Descartes. And Descartes is a philosopher that we're going to be talking about on Monday. We're going to be talking about Descartes and his sort of arguments for skepticism. Okay, so that should just give you sort of an overall big picture visualization of where some philosophers fall. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about some of the motivations behind skepticism. Like I said, it's in some ways a very counterintuitive position. If you go up to somebody on the street and you say, did you know that you don't know anything? If you said, human beings don't know that they have hands, human beings don't know that the world exists, most people would think like, you're crazy, that's an insane view. So let's try to motivate it a bit. Let's try to get into the mindset a little bit. Okay, so first, ask yourself, given my views on the origins of human life, whether you think that's creation, whether you think God created us, maybe ex nihilo or something, whether you think we evolved in a particular way and we have a particular evolutionary history, whether you think this is all just like a random chance, there was like some sort of quantum event and like we all popped into existence 5 minutes ago, whatever you think about the origins of human life, I want you to ask yourself, why expect that we humans would be equipped to know reality as it is? Why should we expect that? Why not think that we develop instead such that our intellectual capacities were geared toward mere survival, right? And why think that surviving would require us to know the truth about anything? And in particular, about physics or economics or sociology or critical literary theory? Like, why think our brains are equipped to do that? That's insane, right? Okay, here's a second sort of avenue of motivating skepticism. Ask yourself, how often have people been extremely confident in a view only to discover that it was false? Not only throughout history, right? So take all the failed sciences, all of the scientific consensus that were proven false by revolutionary experiments, et cetera. But even think about your everyday life, right? Take your own case. Don't you now, today, believe almost entirely different things than you did 5 or 10 years ago? And what makes you think you're not going to radically change your views again in another 5 or 10 years? But if your future self is going to see your current self as deceived or naive, or somehow in ignorance, in the same way that your current self sees your past self as deceived or in ignorance, what grounds the confidence that you now have in your current beliefs or views? Okay, so there's 2 big picture attempts to kind of motivate skepticism a bit, to get us thinking, oh, maybe it's not just totally insane, maybe there's something there. And now we're going to talk really briefly about Socratic ignorance and Socrates' particular form of skepticism. Okay, so the things we just mentioned, those are some of the reasons that motivated Socrates. Some of the details like get lost in the Apology, even though I think they were helpfully brought out in the podcast that you all listened to. But I'm just going to give you a quick recap of the Apology, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So Socrates claims, crucially, that a friend of his was told by the oracle that he, Socrates, was the wisest among men. Incredulous, for he had long thought of himself as supremely ignorant, knowing only that he didn't know anything, he tested the hypothesis by cross-examining powerful men of great intellect, mostly politicians, poets, artists, others, sophists, other so-called philosophers of his time. We engaged in these discussions, though, through a process called the elenchus, right? This sort of process of asking questions and asking further questions based on those questions. He realized that none of them actually knew anything at all, even though they thought they knew stuff. And this led to the insight that he had that the oracle was right, that wisdom consisted of something much different than what people typically thought it was, that instead of having knowledge about a great many things in the world, was actually the intellectual humility to know that one didn't know. And for Socrates, this meant the intellectual honesty to admit that skepticism about almost everything, truth, justice, knowledge, beauty, the divine, was the only philosophically respectable position. In these terms, then, Socratic ignorance is a form of skepticism, And if Socrates is to be believed, a manifestation of intellectual virtue, right, of humility and honesty. Mentioned a second ago, the elenchus. The elenchus, just so that you have an actual definition of it that you can refer back to, is a philosophical discussion technique where clarificatory questions are posed to those who claim to have some substantive knowledge in order to illuminate the nature of that knowledge or to reveal that it is ultimately illusory. It's like a mouthful. I'm going to let that sit there for a second in case anybody's copying it down. So obviously Socrates uses this to great effect in his skeptical project, but philosophers still use the elenchus today. The idea is that if we can carefully bear down, clarifying ever more precisely, we're likely to arrive at the fundamental or atomic expressions of truth, basic propositions, right? And in a way, much of our engagement in this class via the tools that you all learned in logic and in the argument game take this form, right? And it takes this form for granted. Okay, so hopefully you have the elenchus definition down. I can give that to you later if you need it. Really briefly, because I said I wanted you all to know about philosophical dialogues and what they are, and their relationship to the elenchus. Basically, philosophical dialogues represent philosophers or represent philosophical views by embodying them in particular philosophers engaging in the elenchus. Almost all the Platonic dialogues are like this to some extent. Okay, so here's our conclusion then. Just going to end kind of a big picture summary and question for you. Okay, so let's take a huge step back. Socrates' main claim in the Apology and elsewhere is that he knows only that he knows almost nothing. And that this kind of skepticism, this Socratic ignorance, is the greatest expression of wisdom or intellectual virtue that we can hope to attain. While there's obviously something right in this claim, if you're not convinced, I suggest you just look at the vicious ignorance expressed confidently on Twitter every second, like constantly, just like check Twitter now. So there's something right about what Socrates is saying, but it's not clear that we have to be quite as skeptical as Socrates. Our main question throughout the remainder of this class period and the next will be how skeptical we ought to be in our own lives and whether, how, and to what extent skepticism can be refuted. So in a pithy sort of phrase, we're going to be asking the question, what, if anything, do you know?